So in Unit 13, we're going to look at encoder-decoder networks in a little more detail. So far, we've been looking at both convolutional neural networks, networks that take an image and convert them down into some sort of representation or encoding of it, like identify it as a cat or a dog. Or when we looked at sequences, recurrent neural networks, and similar things where we take a sequence and try to identify it in some ways, or else just predict the next item in the sequence. Encoder-decoder networks are a little more different. They take an approach where we will take an image, encode it into some internal representation, and decode it into another representation. Same with the sequences. So let's first look at, since we've been looking at recurrent neural networks and long short-term memory networks, that looks at those a little bit. So the general link, here's this second article here talking about these sequence-to-sequence models, which is what this sort of stuff, well, one example of this is, and this is used, sequence-to-sequence is a version of this that was used by Google for machine translation. So again, the idea is they're given a sequence of letters or sounds, and then you are going to translate that into a different language for that. It's also sometimes used for video capturing, where you have a set of videos and you're trying to describe what the video is happening, what's happening in the video. And again, this is not that old, but getting a little old. It's 2014 where it was first introduced. And so the idea is that you take a sequence of words, for example, feed it into some recurrent neural networks here. And again, this shows multiple recurrent neural networks, but again, that's just because recurrent networks take the input. So really, we just have one sequence here, input, and one recurrent network, and we feed the first word in, get a second word, third word, fourth word. So we feed in each word in the sentence into this, and we maintain some internal state here. And then from that, we have some encoding vector here. This is often a dense or flat layer that encodes it. And at the same time, we feed that out to another recurrent network that sends out output here. And this is often called the decoder. And this generates one sequence at a time. One word at a time is output. And so we can feed in words and train it to generate other words out here, and we should be maintaining some internal states. And the idea is that this creates some encoding vector here, some encoding information here that's useful. Here's another version of this. The first part of this paper actually talks about long short-term memory networks and things like this that you should be already familiar with. So this is just part 2 of this. And again, here we're feeding in to sequences or sentence one word at a time, and we're generating output, some sentence often in a different language. And again, we're encoding into some state, which is often again a large flat or dense network or something like that for that. So that's the whole idea. We have input, feeding it into an encoder that generates some internal state, and that we get some output from that. And here's a long short-term memory network version of this. Again, let's say we have one long short-term memory network here. We feed the words in it one at a time. We get some encoding, and in this way they're calling it a thought vector. And again, we're feeding it to a long short-term memory network and using that to decode the network and generate one word at a time out here. The model for these, at least for long short-term memory networks, are actually quite simple in some parts. We have an encoding layer here. We have a some sort of long short-term memory network layer here. This one is actually using a combination of convolutional neural networks and long short-term memory networks here. And then we're doing 2 layers of that. So this is generating our decoding, our decoding network. I'm sorry, that was decoding. I need to scroll up here to get to the encoding network. So the encoding network again is just an input layer here. They have a dropout layer, a long short-term memory network, and again, they're using this combination of convolutional neural networks and long short-term memory networks. But you can also just use a standard long short-term memory network here. So they're using that. They're using another layer of that. And so then they're ending up with this encoding information from those two layers. And they feed that in, that's the encoding stuff, and then they feed that into a decoding layer. And so the decoding layer, our networks, again, it takes the input from the encoding layer and sets things up, and it has again these convolutional neural networks built out along short-term memory networks here for this. So one of the great powers of encoder-decoder networks is this internal state or representation here, and how that actually seems to take some of the meanings or information of this encoded in a useful space. This is sometimes called a word vector because again, we're taking words, feeding them in here, and we're taking all these sentences together and trying to encode the meaning of this information here. And again, we have often a multi-dimensional space here. So sometimes we actually encode different letters into a word or something like that. And that's been shown to have some pretty cool properties. I've added a link in here to this article here, this amazing power of word vectors, just to give you kind of an idea of one level of what this is. And Google and others have been working on encoding words in a vector using this sort of encoding mechanism. And so again, they have a vector of, and each pixel or spot in that pixel will represent a word. So we have a whole bunch of possible words, and each thing will be encoded once. And then we encode this in kind of a multi-dimensional space using this sort of information and how it's set up. And what's interesting here is that when we map this multi-dimensional space of these words, and we've trained the network to get the right sort of encoding, it learns simple things like in this multi-dimensional space, the vector for man and woman are different from each other, but in the same way that uncle and aunt or king and queen are different from each other here. So then if you know that the plural of king is kings, and then you know how to shift that to queen, you can also shift the same way to queen. So there's the way plurals and gender information is stored in this network sometimes is useful. So there's some really cool encodings of how these word vectors store this information and how they're related to each other. So this encoding, and that's just one example, but what we found is that this encoding that we create here can be very useful. In fact, we can train these networks. We can train these networks like in English to do create some encoding, general encoding, and then predict this or generate the same English back or a similar meaning English back here, and just build up a really nice encoding here. And then with this encoding vector, we can swap out the encoder or the decoder. So we can have an English encoder to encode any English language, and then swap in different language decoders. So to just train different decoders here, and so use this same kind of encoding vector and just swap in and out different things. Same with images or other things where we can create some internal encoding and then we can swap out, and so the encoder and decoder can be somewhat separate here if they're trained properly with the right technique. Okay, so that's sequence-to-sequence encoding. Just a brief introduction to this UNet. We're gonna, in the practice, you'll do this some more. And this is a good video. Watch this video about the original developers of this Encoded-Decoder network, or UNet. So UNet is more about image understanding, and I go over this fair amount in the practice stuff. Talks about image segmentation, where we're trying to do it at a pixel level, identify what part of an image is a person or different things. And again, we're often using this in medical imaging to try to identify cancer or other things. And again, we're doing pixel by pixel imaging here. And you'll look at 2 examples of that in the assignment, including this salt example that's used by petroleum industry a lot. But the goal here is, again, we're going back now, we're doing images, so we're doing our convolutional neural networks, our convolutions, and our max pooling, again, where we take 4 pixels and convert that to a single 1 pixel. It's taking a like 8 by 8 image and shrinking it down to a 4 by 4 image and things like that. And so this looks at this UNet architecture here, where we'll use a set of convolutions on an image. So here we're starting with a large image, 500 by 500 pixels. We do a number of convolutions on here, and then we do a max pooling to shrink its size down to about 280 here. And then we've doubled the number of filters that we applied, convolutional filters, and then we do a max pooling again, and then we do 2 sets of convolutional filters, and again doubling the number of filters because we halved the size of the image, and then again we're half sizing the image again with max pooling and doubling the number of filters we're using. And then we get some internal state, and this again, so that we've encoded this into some internal state. And then we use reverse convolution or reverse max pooling and up pooling to generate these images and recreate the original size image generally here as we go. And we also take this, so in sequence to sequence, it's just this one final encoding that is used to generate the out. In UNet, we also use the encodings along the way. So this network sees both the built-up layer from this encoding, but it also sees this similar image with all of its filters from before. So it uses both sets of information concatenated together to create this. So you can train this, give it images and train it on different output images, and it will learn images and generate output images here for that. And again, sometimes you'll see these encoding decoding swapped around somewhat. There's a fair number of examples of like paintings done in one style and another style, so you can train images to generate a different paint style, and then you can swap in different images, and then it will generate those images in a different paint style, things like that. This is UNet. There's now a number of other similar architectures out here for auto encoding and decoding images. So that's the main idea, is that we encode the images or the sequences or whatever we have into some internal state, and then we use a similar kind of a mirror network to decode them into some useful representation. You look again some more of this at practice, and you can watch the video on that.